Morning, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Americana. I'm Julie Roginski here with Olga Lautman, and we are so pleased this week to have David Kramer, who is the executive director of the George W. Bush Institute, but also an expert in Russia and Ukraine and all the things that we talk about on the show. So it is wonderful to have you here, David. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Good to see you both.
Thank you.
David, your institute just released a study about the war at 4 years old, the Russia-Ukraine war. We have to specify which war we're talking about these days, but we're here to talk first about the war in Ukraine that's been going on for not really 4 years. It's been going on for even a dozen years longer than that, which we'll get to in a moment. And then we can talk about what's going on in the Middle East as well, because all these things are interconnected. Tell us a little bit about what your key findings are in that report and what Europe needs to do to change to help Ukraine win this war, but mostly what the key findings are.
Our report that we released in connection with the 4th anniversary of the full-scale invasion, which, by the way, as you both know and your listeners know, is not the start of when Russia attacked Ukraine. That goes back to 2014. Some people would argue, obviously, interference in Ukraine's affairs goes back much further. But if you start this in 2014 with the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine, the illegal annexation of Crimea, the move into the Donbass, and then that continues with the full-scale invasion that occurred in February 24th, 2022. Our view is that most predictions about how the war would unfold were wrong. Certainly the predictions that Russia would invade were accurate, but a lot of people, including those in the Kremlin, perhaps most importantly, assumed that Russian forces would go in and the war would be over in a matter of days or weeks. And what we argue is that here we are now into the 5th year of this terrible conflict, which Putin started. It is black and white on who's responsible for this. There are some people who refer to this as Biden's war or whatever. This is Putin's war. Putin started it. Putin owns it. The Biden administration tried to help Ukraine. President Zelensky, of course, is trying to defend his country and fight off Russian invading forces. But the point of the report is that there is still a possibility and an opportunity for Ukraine to win because we believe that Russia is not interested in ending the war. Putin has shown no signs of backing off of his original goals, which include removal of the Zelensky leadership, permanent neutrality for Ukraine, which means no NATO membership, demilitarization of Ukraine's armed forces, recognition of Russian control of occupied territory, but also control of or recognition of territory Russia doesn't even control. That's what Russia has been pushing too. And so Russia has not budged from these positions. And very recently, Russian officials keep referring to the understanding that was reached in Anchorage, Alaska, when Putin met with President Trump. And none of us, I think, knows about any understanding that was reached between the two sides. There was nothing public. The lunch was canceled. The two leaders didn't take questions after they made initial statements. And yet the administration has also not refuted this claim by the Russians that there was an understanding. The understanding, if it occurred, probably resembles the 28-point plan that the Russians proposed. And but there are no signs that we see of Russian interest in this. So it means, what does it mean? I apologize for going on so long.
No, please do.
It means providing military support to Ukraine, because Ukraine has, even just in the past couple weeks, made gains in the southeastern part of Ukraine that Russia has occupied, pushing Russian forces back. The Russian gains, to the extent that you can even use that word, have been minimal, maybe about 1% of additional territory, roughly going from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, that kind of corridor. Enormous costs. But if we provide Ukraine with the military assistance it needs, Ukraine can inflict even more damage on Russian invading forces. Support Ukraine financially. This is where the Europeans can come in. But it also means taking those frozen Russian assets that are sitting particularly in European financial institutions, Euroclear especially, and making those available to Ukraine. And Russia should never see those assets again. It means providing the kind of political support Ukraine needs, tightening the sanctions that have been imposed, going after this shadow fleet that is a key outlet for Russia to export its energy, and in general, just to make sure that the West stands with Ukraine, never give up on holding Russia accountable for the war crimes it has committed, for the kidnapping of children, for which Putin was indicted by the International Criminal Court, and apply pressure on China. China continues to provide a lifeline to Russia through import of Russian energy, albeit at a discounted price, provides dual-use technology that the Russians use, and press for a ceasefire. The Ukrainians have agreed to a ceasefire. Putin won't even agree to a ceasefire. The U.S. side had been pushing for a ceasefire until the meeting in Anchorage, and we seem to have dropped that. So again, apologies for going on, but that's sort of how we see it.
What do you make of that Anchorage meeting? Without getting too conspiratorial, although we can for sure, we certainly have been known to do that on the show. But what do you make of that Anchorage meeting where suddenly, well, maybe not so suddenly, but very overtly, things seem to have changed so much in favor of Putin and have continued to change in favor of Putin? I mean, since that Anchorage meeting, you've had Wickoff and Kushner go to Moscow repeatedly. There have been meetings with Dmitriev, Putin's bagman, for lack of a better description. Where are we as the United States, as the leader of NATO, or at least for today, he's still the leader of NATO? Where do you see our role here, and how do you see it playing out?
I think the Anchorage meeting was probably better avoided. There was the red carpet treatment that Putin received, in contrast to, say, Zelensky when he visits the United States. President Trump tried. He tried to deal with Putin, but I think he perhaps has come to recognize that Putin isn't interested in peace. I mean, he has used the phrase Putin may be tapping him along, which is just playing the string out, buying time for Russia to rebuild. It is, as I said, I think very clear that Putin is not interested in peace. What he is hoping for is American pressure on Ukraine to force it to make territorial compromises. But as you both know, we're not just talking about land. We're not just talking about territory. We're talking about Ukrainians who live on this territory. And the majority of Ukrainians do not support territorial concessions, particularly if there are not credible security guarantees provided by the West. But we would be turning over essentially between 3 to 5 million Ukrainians to live under brutal Russian repression. And that is something I don't think anyone in the West should be talking about. You see these various articles in Foreign Affairs and elsewhere that the Ukrainians should make these concessions and sacrifice the land. They don't talk about the people on the land. And so to me, I think the United States should take a very firm stand and never recognizing the illegal annexation by Russia of Ukrainian territory, to include Crimea, and that we should recognize that President Zelensky has done, I think, pretty much everything he can. He's even been open to the idea of holding elections in Ukraine, even though it is against Ukraine's constitution and law to hold elections during martial law. Why was martial law imposed in Ukraine? Because Russia invaded Ukraine in a full-scale way, February of 2022. So I think the U.S. side needs to recognize Putin is just stringing them along. He is not interested in peace. This is his war. It is not Biden's war. It's not Zelensky's war. It is Putin's war. I appreciate that the U.S. has tried to press for an end to it. The loss of life is a tragedy, totally avoidable, never should have happened. And the reason it happened is because Putin woke up and decided he wanted to invade Ukraine, because he also doesn't view Ukraine as a true independent state. And that claim goes back to meetings he had with President Bush when he was in office in 2008. It obviously continued in his long treatise in July of 2021, a few months before the full-scale invasion. So I think we need to recognize that there is the a guilty party, the aggressor that invaded Ukraine. There is the innocent victim that has been the target of Russian aggression and invasion and war crimes, and that's Ukraine. And to me, we should not be playing the role of neutral arbiter. We should be standing unambiguously on Ukraine's side.
Right.
And I'll just add a few key points for what you said, David. One, the 3 to 5 million people that would fall that are under Russian occupation, if the U.S. forces Ukraine to hand that territory, and if that ever happened, it won't. I mean, this is a centuries-old battle. Never mind even going back to Bush. This goes back, centuries of this war and Russia's invasions and genocide of Ukrainians and on and on. But if I think people fail to realize that is 3 to 5 million people that will be added, or at least say a few million that will be added towards Russia's military, that will be forced to go and fight Europeans. And a lot of people seem to forget that when they wave away and say, oh, big deal, it's only 20% of territory, that should Ukraine fall, Ukrainians under gunpoint, with Russia threatening to kill their families, will be forced to go and fight in Estonia, Lithuania, France, or Germany, or wherever Russia wants to go. So I think that is a very key point, in all of this, and why it's not just, territory or just, never mind the people, but the fact that, like for national security of the continent of Europe, I mean, this really becomes another pointer.
And Olga, that's already happening. I mean, we're already seeing in the part of Ukraine that Russia already claims and occupies, Ukrainians being pressed into military service. And if they don't, they pay a steep price. They're subjected to torture and arrest and abuse. And look at what the Russians did in Bucha. Look at what they've done in Mariupol. Look at what they do in Crimea. The Russian government doesn't respect the rights of its own citizens, and it would be absurd to think that they would respect the rights of Ukrainian citizens that were under their control. And so in forcing Ukraine to make territorial concessions and placing these millions of Ukrainians under Russian rule, we would be endangering them in a terrible way. And one other quick point is Ukrainians have fought at enormous cost to not only protect this territory, but to try to regain it. And militarily, it is an important part of Ukraine. And so we would essentially be saying, well, the sacrifices Ukrainians made to try to defend and regain this territory were all for naught. Just give it up. It doesn't matter. This is the only way to end this war. I think the only way the war ends is through further military pressure on Russian forces that either produces some move inside Russia, and I frankly don't think that is terribly likely, sadly, or something I think that is perhaps a little more possible, but I don't want to overstate it. The Russian soldiers on the front lines just say enough is enough. They're tired of being treated as cannon fodder by their own leaders, by corrupt military commanders. You know the statistic that CSIS put out about 1.2 million casualties on the Russian side, maybe as many as 450,000 deaths among that 1.2 million. At some point, despite the deathonomics campaign where the Russian government has turned joining the military into an income generator for poor families, despite that, I think there is the chance that people on the front lines, the Russian soldiers on the front lines, would just say, screw it, this is not working. It is a death sentence to be sent there. And remember, they're relying on North Koreans. They've relied on Africans. They've relied on Central Asians. They relied on prisoners. They are having difficulty staffing up the front lines here because people do know what happens if you're on the front lines. You're not likely to make it back in one piece.
Let me ask you about something that you said in your report, because I want to talk about the timing here. You issued it on February 24th. And that was not so long ago, but it's also a lifetime considering what's happened since. What you said in the report, and I do want to just stress again to folks, like, this is March 5th that we're talking today. So this was about 2 weeks ago.
Yep.
And you said, as you're talking about why Putin is not winning the war, you said, in addition, Russia's economic outlook is dire. Oil and gas revenue is the main source of income financing. This war plummeted by more than 50%, exacerbating Russia's already challenging budget situation. And then you quote the Wall Street Journal, in saying that there, and this is key, dozens of tankers filled with Russian oil are floating at sea without buyers. Western powers are seizing the aging ships the country relies upon. Buyers of Russian oil are demanding the steepest discount to global oil prices since the early months of the war in Ukraine. That was happening. And all of a sudden, in the last week and just in the last few days, we have, it seems like we've invaded Iran or about to, and the price of oil has spiked tremendously. And now, obviously, oil that was destined for China, oil that was destined for India going through the Straits of Hormuz no longer is able to get through a lot of the time, most of the time. And the price of oil for those two countries especially has spiked, whereupon enter Vladimir Putin. Does this change the calculus and make Putin's job much easier, or at least the financial stress that he was under much easier because of what's happening in Iran and the Middle East right now?
Yeah, it's a great question, Julie. And it will, over time, I think, work to his benefit, but it won't provide an immediate salve to the problem that he is facing, which is a budget crisis, which is using up their reserves, struggling to provide these bonuses to individuals and families who join the military. That has gone up and down. Toward the end of last year, the bonuses that were being paid actually went down because local regional budgets were suffering. They weren't able to make those payments. The Kremlin has provided additional resources to boost those again. And so the Russian economy is not doing well. It has been heavily militarized. Roughly 40% of the Russian economy, of Russian federal spending is devoted to the military and security services. About 8 to 9% of Russia's GDP goes toward the military campaign, to the war effort. I don't want to call it a military campaign. That's what Putin does. He calls it a special military operation, refuses to call it a war. And so it is imposed a tremendous drain on the Russian economy that I think is not sustainable. I'm not an economist, but I've read some who are, and they think that over time this is not sustainable. But when that point comes, I don't think anyone knows. And then you have the situation with price of oil going up. This is likely to be a help to Putin. The Indians, after cutting back on imports of Russian energy, have now gone not completely the other way, but are increasing their imports of Russian energy. The Chinese are likely to do the same, and those are the two biggest purchases of Russian energy. And so that is likely to provide a financial boost that Putin will then in turn use for his military war efforts. So that's one implication of what's been happening just in the past week with the situation in the Middle East. The Ukrainians are also nervous that this will lead to a diversion of weapon systems that were planned to provide to the Ukrainians, that they may not see those as well. Patriot missiles in particular are incredibly important to Ukraine. The Ukrainians are really self-sufficient when it comes to drone technology and production, including anti-drone technology. But Patriot missiles are what they need to fend off the Russian ballistic missiles that keep getting fired. But there is one other point, which is Russia once again has proven to be a very unreliable partner. We saw Bashar al-Assad have to flee Syria, and Russia didn't do anything about it other than try to keep its base in Tartus. You saw Maduro arrested by U.S. forces. Where was Russia there? And now you see Iran under attack, and Russia doesn't seem to be doing anything about it. It's bogged down in Ukraine. And so Russia has not been the most reliable partner to these leaders in their time of need. And I think countries should take note of that.
But neither have we, right? If we're going to be honest about what's been going on in the last few days, the president has talked about, not in so many words, but invading Spain in order to use their bases, which is totally contrary to any treaties that we signed. I think potentially even under President Bush, maybe not, maybe a little later. But the point is that that's just a violation of the treaties that we signed with Spain about the use of those bases. Certainly, you have a huge rift between France and Great Britain and the United States, talking about defensive versus offensive measures. If you were planning to put a stake in the heart of NATO, and I'm not even going back to a few months ago when we were in our ongoing obsession with Denmark and with Greenland.
Greenland, yeah.
And certainly talking about potentially making Canada the 51st state, maybe in jest, maybe not. Although I'm not sure you should joke about any of this with this president. They're not the most reliable ally, but it sounds like we're not the most reliable ally to our allies as well anymore. It's just a very interesting reordering of everything that's happened through the Pax Americana era of 1945 to 20, I guess, if I wanted to be generous, early 2025.
Yeah. I think what you're getting at is this underscores the importance of maintaining our alliances, maintaining close ties with our best partners. Fellow democracies are our best partners. The NATO alliance, with a couple of exceptions I will acknowledge, is made up of democracies that have pledged to come to each other's aid should they be attacked or invaded. And as you both know, the only time that NATO has invoked Article 5 is when Al-Qaeda attacked the United States on 9/11. And our allies came to our time of need. I think we also have to remember that we've had differences with some of our NATO allies over the years. Over Iraq, for example, in 2003, France and Germany did not support that. But we had disagreements, not ruptures, to borrow a term that has been used recently. And I think what we need to remember is that in times of need, not every ally is going to be there on the same page with us. We may have disagreements, but enough will, particularly if we maintain these close ties, explain what it is we're doing, why we're doing it. I think that is a key part of trying to win over support for what we're trying to do. Allies are important, not just right now in dealing with Iran. Allies are important for dealing with China. Allies are important for dealing with Russia. Allies are our best trade partners. They are not the ones from whom we face threats. Our threats, the dangers we face, come from extremist authoritarian regimes. And that is why I think it is important to support the cause of freedom and democracy and human rights around the world, so that we could see an advance of democracy and freedom. Freedom House, an organization I used to run now about a dozen years ago, produces an annual report called Freedom in the World. Yep. It's an indispensable guide to how political rights and civil liberties are being observed and adhered to in countries everywhere. And I would bet that when it comes out with its latest report later this month, we will see 20 years of decline of freedom around the world. That is a cause for concern.
In this country, I would say, right?
What's that?
Including here at home.
Yes, I would imagine so. Yeah, I haven't seen the report. I haven't been privy to the deliberations, but I imagine that is a possibility. But the point is that it is in U.S. interest. This is not a question of values versus interests. This is an issue about supporting universal values, because if you just talk about American values or Western values, that is less appealing to countries far away from the United States. But if you talk about universal values that include the right to vote, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, separation of powers, a vibrant civil society, independent media, all of those things, I think those countries that have those ingredients, if you will, are more likely to be our friends in times of need. And that's why it is important to distinguish between authoritarian regimes that pose a threat and democracies that may have disagreements with us, but are likely to be there when we need them.
So, David, I want to follow up on this. And Olga, I know you're having connection issues. So
I am having horrible connection issues. So go ahead.
Well, then I'll keep talking until you're ready to jump in. But
yeah, I can jump in as long as like my internet keeps going in and out. The Kremlin gremlins.
I just have one follow-up question to what you said, because George Bush, and you could agree or disagree with his foreign policy, and you could agree or disagree with what he did in Iraq, but there was a component of morale politique to what George W. Bush was engaged in around the world that you just espoused, right? What you just talked about was something that President Bush believed in. And again, you could agree or disagree with the way the execution happened, but it was a core policy of the United States. And it was a core policy of the United States, really, I think, for every president. Again, agree or disagree with Richard Nixon, with Obama's foreign policy, doesn't matter. I think from 1945 till today, or maybe until last year, with a 4-year interregnum there, that was a foreign policy belief in the United States that there were shared values that we had to espouse around the world, that our NATO allies, rightly said, right? They did not go along with us to Iraq the way I think President Bush might have wanted, but nevertheless, there was a shared understanding and a shared mission of what this alliance is all about. Same goes with our allies in Asia and around the world. Do you think that anything that you just talked about right now is present in this current White House? In other words, is there anybody who either has the will or the ability to sit with our NATO allies and say, listen, we got to go along with this together. This is about our shared values. This is about our commonality. A, is that happening? And B, do they even want that to happen or believe that this should be happening from your perspective?
It's a different time. I think that the current administration does not place the emphasis on support for democracy and freedom and human rights that I think past administrations have. And that support over the years and over administrations has been uneven for sure. And when push comes to shove, sometimes we place more emphasis on economic or energy interest or security interest. I've always viewed it as a three-legged stool, which is there are economic and energy interests or security interests, but there are also democracy and freedom interests. And often throughout history over the past few decades, that third leg of the stool gets shortchanged. And my argument, the reason I use the stool metaphor is the stool then becomes a little unbalanced. And so it's important to make sure that we attach importance to democracy and human rights and freedom issues. The president in a speech last year in Saudi Arabia made it clear that the United States was not going to tell countries in the region how to govern. There has been, I think, a reduction in emphasis on this in the State Department. The bureau that I used to head, the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau, has been reduced rather significantly. It's still there. There's an assistant secretary confirmed who I hear very good things about. I haven't had a chance to meet him myself, but I hear very good things about him. I think Secretary Rubio cares deeply about these issues. And I think there are some tests out there that we'll see, and Venezuela probably is at the top of that list, where the U.S. military and intelligence agencies went in, conducted a brilliant operation of removing Maduro without any loss of American life. There can be a debate about pro or con on whether we should have done that, the legality of it. But the point is it happened, and it opened up the possibility for Venezuela to move in a more democratic direction. The question will be, will this administration support that transition? It seems to be quite focused on Delcy Rodriguez, who was the vice president of Maduro. She is now acting president. And it seems that we have shunted aside, if you will, Maria Corina Machado, the main opposition figure. She was not allowed to run, of course, in the 24 election. Edmundo Gonzalez was allowed. He won, but Maduro stole the election. This will be, I think, the key test of the importance and value the administration attaches to these issues. Will we support Venezuela with its opportunity now for the first time in many years to move in a more democratic direction? The Iran situation is too fluid, too early to really comment in detail about that. But I also would argue that one of the reasons we should support Ukraine is that it is a democracy. It's a fragile democracy. It's a democracy with a lot of challenges. We have a lot of challenges here. But we should be supporting a fellow democracy, Ukraine, a country that had been a population of about 40, 41 million people, against a brutal, corrupt, fascist authoritarian regime in Moscow, headed by Vladimir Putin. And so there are times where the United States should, as I said at the outset, unequivocally side with a democracy when it is facing a massive threat coming from an authoritarian regime. It's why we should support, one of the reasons we should support Taiwan. Taiwan is important when it comes to semiconductors, of course, but Taiwan is also important because it's an island democracy. And who's threatening it? A big authoritarian regime in Beijing. And it's a reminder that the way these regimes treat their own people is often indicative of how they'll behave in foreign policy toward other countries. And so we shouldn't be shocked that when the Putin regime cracks down on human rights in Russia, that it threatens Georgia and Ukraine and Belarus. We shouldn't be shocked when the Chinese government and Communist Party repress their own people's rights, that it threatens the island democracy of Taiwan. We shouldn't be shocked when the Ayatollahs and the leadership in Iran crack down and kill maybe 32,000 protesters in January, that they are the lead state sponsor of terrorism, or North Korea, where it's arguably the most repressive regime in the world, poses a threat to South Korea and other countries. So the nature of regimes matters. And I do think it is important for this administration, past administrations, future administrations, to support democracy, freedom, and human rights. It does, I think, make for a better foreign policy and advances U.S. interests. Sorry for the long answer.
No, that's a great answer. Thank you.
I agree. Looking into all these regimes, I mean, we really better sooner than later we need to get back on track at pushing back, especially with North Korea. I mean, we are right now striking Iran over the so-called nuclear threat. But North Korea, at the same time, has been building up their nuclear program with Russia's assistance.
Yeah.
And I don't see, like for the past several years, they've been, kind of sidelined and no one really has been paying attention. But this is a very big emerging threat.
Can I just say on North Korea, I apologize for interrupting, just quickly on North Korea, but just to build on your point, think about the, 10 to 15,000 North Korean soldiers that were sent to Russia to help Russia fight against Ukraine. North Korea, I don't think made a huge difference there, but they certainly absorbed a lot of the Ukrainian response to it. They were there in the Kursk Oblast that the Ukrainians had moved into. And so North Korea also plays a role that way. North Korea's relationship with Iran has been rather close over the years. And it's this CRINC. We're doing work here at the Bush Institute on what we call CRINC, the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea axis. And even though I said Russia and China have proven to be rather unreliable partners to some of these regimes that have been in trouble lately, they do work closely together. They share worst practices, if you will, rather than best practices. They come to each other's aid, at least when the United States is not militarily involved. And so this axis of these four regimes is a challenge to us, and we need to be mindful. I apologize, I interrupted you.
No, and actually to add to that, now that you have Ukrainian eyes on North Korea, because frankly, we didn't care about North Korea until they decided to invade Ukraine. Now that you have Ukrainian eyes and intelligence on North Korea, I mean, there have been a lot of, reports of Russia using the Shadow Fleet, for instance, to move nuclear material to North Korea, that Russia giving nuclear material and sending scientists to North Korea to assist with the building up of their nuclear program in exchange for military, of Chinese military training in Russia's military schools over the past several months, in exchange for China providing, military components for their missile program and drone program and everything else that China's been assisting. So, I mean, this is, the West and frankly, the whole international community is playing with fire, because when you allow a rogue nation like North Korea, to gain a nuclear program, and you don't put pressure on Russia in particular. And Russia was also responsible for assisting Iran with their nuclear program. So the fact that, there's no pressure being put on Russia is a little bit, mind-boggling, because this didn't happen post the full-scale invasion. This is something that's been happening well over a decade. And, for the most part, a lot of the international community did turn around and look the other way until after the full-scale invasion in 22, when you started having more scrutiny over Russia's partnerships and actions when it comes to China, North Korea, Venezuela, Iran, and other authoritarian countries.
And think about, had the Iranians not provided Russia at the early stages of the full-scale invasion the Shahid drones, Russian forces would have been in much worse shape. That support for Russia from the Iranian regime was critical. Russia suffered badly after the initial push into Ukraine. Ukraine regained more than 50% of the occupied territory. But Russia has been since able to use Iranian Shahid drones in particular to inflict real damage on the Ukrainians. The Russians now have essentially adopted the technology and production themselves. And so in some respects, Iran has become less critical to Russia's war efforts. But again, it's another connection where these regimes support each other, sustain each other, and try to attack their neighbors and democracies and try to stay on offense. And it's time, some of us in this community have been talking, it's time for the democracies to go on offense. We play way too much defense. And how we do that is really something for us to debate and discuss. But we always seem to be in react mode rather than proactive mode. And I think it's time for us to reconfigure that.
I'm old enough, sorry, Julie. I'm old enough to remember IRGC thugs crawling into Crimea to assist Russia in the early days of that. And this is after the joint, command centers in Syria, and what IRGC and Hezbollah and Russia did to Syrians. Upwards of 700,000 Syrians were massacred by Assad and, their friends. So yeah, 100%.
Just to get back to this war, because the question is, what short of, let's say we give Ukraine everything that we just talked about, which I think is a big if, especially in the current circumstances. But let's assume we gave Ukraine everything we wanted to do. I assume you mean also offensive weapons that could reach potentially to Moscow or St. Petersburg as well.
Tomahawks, absolutely.
Yeah. Because
Julie, sorry, a real quick interruption. I apologize. Remember, it was President Trump in December 2017, after the Obama administration refused to provide lethal military assistance. It was President Trump initially in 2017 that agreed to provide Javelin missiles to Ukraine. Right. So that was a very important step. I apologize.
No. But so from my perspective, let's say that we do, whether surreptitiously or not, at least what we did in Afghanistan back in the 1970s and 80s to help Ukrainians. Is that really how you see this ending? Do you see this being a war of attrition where Russia just goes bankrupt after a decade, or hopefully it won't be a decade, but after years and years of this kind of military action? Or do you see this ending potentially in us providing javelins and other offensive weapons to Moscow against Moscow, to the point where this suddenly becomes a war that very much hits home, because the way Putin's been getting away with this domestically, at least, is he has been taking this from, the oblasts that are not even the oblasts, but just, regions that are very, very far from the centers of power. It has not hit home to the average Muscovite or to the average St. Petersburgian. And this is just a war that's happening elsewhere that they see on TVs being ginned up for propaganda. But much like the war in Iran, or Iraq for that matter, didn't really affect the average American, except for people who were fighting there and their families. Doesn't really affect people in Russia yet. So how do you see this ending if we were to do everything that you suggest that we could do?
Well, keep in mind, I think the previous U.S. administration was preparing to provide the kind of assistance we provided to the Afghan resistance on the assumption that the Russians would roll right on in. Right. And there were people who were predicting that providing military assistance to Ukraine would make no difference. There was not a very good article in Foreign Policy in January of 2022. I won't mention the author's name, who said military assistance won't matter. And that was just so fundamentally wrong. And then you had the frustrating experience for Ukrainians where they would ask the administration for certain assistance. The answer would be no. They'd ask again. The answer would be maybe. They'd ask a third time, and the answer would finally be yes. But in that intervening period, Ukrainians were getting killed. The U.S. assistance is down by about 99% from where it had been. The current administration has made a decision to not continue the military assistance that was provided. You've heard recent comments by officials that had we not provided Ukraine with these weapons, we could be using them right now in the Middle East. I think that's unfair to the Ukrainians. They were in desperate need of military assistance, and it was right that we provided that assistance. I do think that Ukraine is now about 60%. I mentioned about almost totally self-sufficient when it comes to drones on the Ukrainian side. Overall, they're about 60% self-sufficient when it comes to the military needs. And I think Ukrainians have come to realize they have to increase that percentage significantly, that they cannot rely on either the goodwill or the view that this is in our interest coming from the West. That the Ukrainians, in talking to some recently, and people who have been there recently, I have not been there recently, but others have, there's almost a feeling the Ukrainians have come to this recognition. We have to do this ourselves. Assistance we get from the West, great. It will help, but intelligence sharing that we provide remains really important, and I hope that continues. But I think the Ukrainians have come to the conclusion that they are largely going to have to do this themselves. And we mentioned earlier, they regained some territory in the southeast part of Ukraine. They're pushing back on Russian forces. They seem to be, easy for me to say sitting here in the comfort of Dallas, but they seem to be past the worst of a terrible winter where the Russian forces were trying to bomb them into submission by freezing them to death. I think two things from this is, one, never overestimate the Russians' capabilities and skill when it comes to things like this, and never underestimate the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have proven to be unbelievably heroic and capable, innovative, and they are facing a much bigger force. There was a piece in Foreign Affairs a week or two ago that basically argued Ukraine is losing because Russia's bigger. It has more people. I mean, in that case, there are many wars that should have been won by the bigger power that weren't.
So is Afghanistan, right? I mean, Afghanistan.
There you go. Exactly. No, absolutely. And so I do think that Ukraine does have a chance. And I think it is by inflicting as much damage on the Russian forces on the front lines. The day that Putin has where his guys on the front lines just say, we've had enough. He is an emperor without clothes. And I don't see a groundswell of protest in Russia for the reasons you were saying, which is the Kremlin controls the narrative inside Russia. The Russian people have been led to believe that Russia is winning this war. It seems Putin believes Russia is winning this war because his generals and intelligence agencies are telling him Russia is winning this war. It's not the case, as we all know. And yet the Kremlin controls that narrative. The Kremlin provides these bonuses to poor families in the outer regions of Russia whose fathers, sons, or brothers sign up to join the military. This is money that's desperately needed for families who can't make ends meet. And so it has become, this term deathonomics, where the Russian government provides funding for families who agree to have a member join the military. But I think the people on the front lines, when they realize what they are facing, they may reach a point. I've been saying this for a while, so take it with a grain of salt. But I do think at some point, the Russians on the front lines would just say, what the hell are we doing here? Ukrainians know why they're fighting. They are fighting for their land, for their freedom, for their lives. I think a lot of the Russians have no clue why they're there, other than they've been paid to go and they've been told to do it, that it serves the greater cause. Well, the greater cause really is only Putin's cause.
Well, I'll just add that nobody in Ukraine who has any kind of memory of being under Soviet occupation with Russia, Moscow, as you know, in charge, wants to ever go to that. Like, people rather frickin' die being chopped up in 7 million pieces than live under Russian occupation. And for the younger generation who doesn't remember what it was like, all they need to do is look at what's happening in Donbass and Crimea, where Russia, after they invaded in 2014, set up concentration camps, disappearances, using rape as a tactic, forcing Ukrainians to go fight Ukrainians on the front line, which is a war crime, and everything that we've seen. So that's, one thing. With the Russians, it's going to be interesting because right now they're having their own inconveniences, which actually might turn into something with internet being shut down across the country.
Yeah,
that actually might be a bigger motivator that might break through their imperialistic, bloodthirsty lust for taking more territory. So that might work. We'll see. Just to shift a little bit towards Europe. Over the past several months, we've seen Russia increasing their aggression now against NATO. I mean, literally, over the past 6 months, we saw drone incursions into Poland via Belarus, nonetheless. Russia's fighter jets crossing into Estonia for 12 minutes, which is, a lifetime in those terms. Targeting a von der Leyen's plane with GPS jamming. They just targeted the French nuclear ship that was in the Baltic for NATO exercises. They sent a drone from Russia's espionage ship towards it, and the Swedes shot down the drone. And you just see every single week something is happening, whether it's airports in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, being shut down, railways being set on fire in Germany, Poland, France. How long do you think it will be before Russia actually either miscalculates and hits a NATO country, or intentionally, launches a war against either, to sweep through the Baltics or through, Poland or Finland or anywhere else?
Well, just to add to your list, Olga, I mean, we've seen Russian agents blow up arms depots in the Czech Republic. We've seen assassinations on European territory, in Berlin, in the UK, and other places. We've seen the cutting of cables undersea that are important for communication purposes for Europe. You mentioned the drones complicating airport traffic. It's also through corruption. You mentioned the report we issued on February 24th about the Russia-Ukraine war. We also did a report, it's on our website, called Strategic Corruption, Russia and Europe. And this is about Russia's use of corruption to try to win over allies in Europe, or put them in a compromising position where they may be vulnerable to Russian influence, getting them on boards of Russian companies, looking to increase and expand their influence through purchases of property in other places. Why London is called Londongrad, because of all the Russian ownership of property there. And so Europe needs to be on much greater guard against not just these a little more kinetic and hybrid activities, but also be on guard for corruption that Russia exports to Europe and the United States.
And what is it with, I mean, particularly I'm thinking about Great Britain, because you're right, London really is Londongrad. I mean, you go to Mayfair, you go to Belgravia in London, and like all the houses don't have the lights on because they're just pass through places where Russian oligarchs launder their money. Is it just an addiction to Russian money? Is it an addiction to real estate money? What is the, like, why is it particularly that the UK has allowed the city of London to be treated like a laundromat for so many years? Knowing, by the way, what it is that the Russians have done on their soil, because the stuff that the Russians have pulled on British soil is a million times worse than they pulled anywhere else in Western Europe.
So I think it's a combination of things, Julie. It is, first of all, a lot of this goes back quite a few years.
Right.
And so we shouldn't think that it's just since 2022 with the full-scale invasion of
no, this is like decades.
Yeah. This has been going on for decades. Yeah. Absolutely right. I think there has been an openness to this. It is a lot of money for real estate agents. It's why greater transparency when it comes to transactions is so important. It's why greater transparency when it comes to serving on boards and that kind of thing. I mean, remember, was it the Austrian foreign minister, after she left office, she joined boards, of course, Gerhard Schroeder being one of the most late cases, absolutely. And on the Nord Stream pipelines decision. So I think it is, in the case of the UK, there's been openness to this kind of investment, these kinds of purchases, because it's money in people's pockets. But it's also interesting to look at the flip side of this. Russia loves to denigrate the West, talk about the evils of capitalism and democracy and all these things. Talk about how NATO is a threat to Russia. The European Union is even a threat. Remember, that's how the Euromaidan revolution started in November 2013, 2014. It wasn't because Ukraine was going to sign up with agreements to NATO. It was because they were going to sign association agreements with the European Union. But the point here is, and with all that condemning and denouncing of the West, where do Russian oligarchs put their money? In the West, because they trust our institutions much more than they trust their own. They know if they keep their money in Russia, it is likely to be confiscated. And so while they're all bashing us, they can't wait to vacation on the Mediterranean coast and buy up property in the UK and elsewhere. So again, this is where we can play offense by cutting off these opportunities for Russians to put their dirty money in our countries, because Russia's greatest export, I would argue, is corruption. But in order to export corruption, we import it. And so we control half of that equation, and we need to do a much better job of pushing back on it.
Yeah, I remember after you mentioned Euromaidan, I remember my friends Daria and Olena running around and saying, you're calling Ukraine corrupt, where we are begging you, we're giving you the accounts and the banks and the people involved in this. This is a two-way street. Shut it down on your end as well, And,
their that organization does great work. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, I have to, I think on behalf of both Olga and myself, because we said we'd keep you until noon our time here on the East Coast, we are so deeply grateful to you, David. This was just wonderful to hear your level of expertise, and actually, even more refreshingly, some good takeaways for people to think about that we could do positively and offensively, because I think what we typically tend to do is lament the situation as it is. But
I do my share of that too.
Yeah. But and some very good food for thought, I think, to me certainly, but I think also to a lot of other people, about the fact that you're absolutely right. Like, not to age myself with my Gen X references, but like, they're the Legion of Doom, right? Like we have to kind of offensively realize you're absolutely right that we are the democracies of the world. And by the way, run the markets. And so we have capabilities, and we have and have much better militaries and so on. I don't know why we're constantly in a defensive crouch when you're absolutely right. We control the world economy. We control not just the United States, but I mean the EU, the United States, the democracies of the world control certainly more military might than anybody else.
Yep.
You know, Russia and China's a different story, but certainly Russia is a failing petro state
Yep.
that, as you said, has, you know, until 2 weeks ago had ships floating in the sea looking for buyers. I mean, what does that tell you about their economic situation? So thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you so much for joining. We hope.
And I'll add one final point on that it's more than just the governments. It's up to all of us. We can do it because it's up to the people. The people shape the governments. And even if the government, you know, doesn't want to fight corruption, we can band together and, you know, go after banks that are assisting Russia or companies that are assisting Russia and kind of start these campaigns to make sure to boycott them, to let people be aware of what is happening. So just to add, we all have the power.
And your point, Olga, we have on our website a weekly series we call Democracy is a Verb. By the way, democracy is not a verb, but the point being, for democracy to work, it needs engagement from its citizens. And it needs informed citizens to engage. And so it's critically important that it isn't just up to our leaders. There are things we can do ourselves, and that's really important to do. I'm grateful to both of you for the opportunity to be with you, and thank you very, very much. I enjoyed this. And
before we go, where could you said that you have this on your website? I love that. Where can people find you? What's the best?
bushcenter.org, all one word, bushcenter.org. Feel free, folks, to get in touch with me if anyone has any questions or anything. I'm happy to answer them. So, yeah, there you go.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Well.
Bye.
Bye.
So, Olga, before we go with everybody else, just a couple of things. I wrote a Substack column today that talks a little bit about this and about how much this war in Iran is helping Vladimir Putin right now. Once again, the real winner here with anything that Donald Trump does is Vladimir Putin. I mean, whether it's the fact that energy prices are not going to go up, which makes Russian oil that much more valuable, whether it is our president continuing to denigrate our NATO allies, like he did with Spain and Great Britain. Thoughts, comments, disputes?
I agree initially, but I want to see how it plays out because I remember, you know, the spike in oil after Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine. I remember, literally in New York, in Staten Island, I was paying $6 plus a gallon at the time. But then it leveled off in a few months, you know, so yes, it was extremely expensive, but then, and actually, interestingly enough, it did go up in March of 2022. And then by like right after Memorial Day weekend, it started leveling off and went back to semi-normal prices. So I want to see how, you know, how long this lasts as far as with that, because with Europe, yes, they're reliant on oil from the Middle East. The United States is self-sufficient. I mean, we technically should be able to handle, you know, even if the Strait of Hormuz was closed for a while, you know, we should be able to handle it, and we should have enough oil capacity even to help our allies. We'll see. I do agree with you. Initially, it is helping. On the other flip side of that, it's hurting Russia reputationally domestically because from the military bloggers, seeing what's happening in Iran, they are, you know, watching another ally go down. And I was actually joking with my dad, if Cuba falls, like my dad was like, you know, Putin needs to be hung by his balls because this is like, in Russian, he said it, because this is like, you know, one of Russia's oldest allies going back decades and decades and decades. And if Russia's not going to step in to save Cuba, this, I would argue, is even worse than, for instance, Iran or Venezuela or anyone else. So domestically, it is hurting with the military bloggers. With that. But yes, I mean, Russia and China are both going to, in the short term, make gains on this, because right now everyone's distracted and looking into the Middle East. One, to, the U.S. is fighting with its allies very publicly, like you said, with Spain and Britain. And Russia right now can, just basically domestically, they're already using the justification, like, look, if Israel and U.S. can go and eliminate a leader and, do what they're doing and start a war, like, they're using this as justification for their full-scale invasion and basically for their occupations. So we'll see. We'll see how it plays out and what happens. We still have ways to go. We have to see how long this lasts. I don't foresee every day Trump is getting us deeper and deeper into the shit. I don't see, him like 4 weeks, like, okay, we're done, we're leaving, because I don't think it's going to work like this, especially that the war is spreading across the whole region. Like today, I saw this morning, overnight, Azerbaijan was hit, and you see Iran, like, literally, like, expanding the war across, even pulling in parts of Europe. So, what are your thoughts?
No, I mean, I think this is a total unmitigated disaster. I don't necessarily think this is bad for Russia. I think, I mean, maybe they won't get their Shahed drones anymore, but in the long term, they're going to get their oil spike, and the more that we're distracted in Iran, the less we are focused on what's happening in Ukraine. So they can continue to do whatever they want. Look, everybody's eye is off the ball here. Everybody's eye is on the Middle East, the last place in the world where I think we need to be. And what we should be focusing on is helping the Ukrainians win this war. So I do not.
That's not happening. Not under this regime.
It's not happening. It's not happening. No. But that's the problem. The problem is that we're in Venezuela. We are in Iran. Yeah. We're in Ecuador, which happened a couple of days ago. We are apparently going to be in Cuba soon. Who the hell? I don't know why this is a thumbs up. I don't know what the hell we're doing. there's a genocidal war happening all over Eastern Europe right now. And I just want people to remember that. And I know we talk about this once a week, but this is something people should remember every single day. Okay, on that note, guys, we finally recorded our Americans podcast. We are going to debut that next week. So look for the first episode of that. Please join us on the Media Network. Olga was there. I was there. A bunch of other people were there. It was awesome. And we're going to do another one this Sunday. And then we'll, people can drop in and drop out if they want. They can come on in. So that's happening. And then Olga and I will be back next Thursday for another episode of Pax Americana. And that was great to have David there. Olga, thank you for arranging that, because he was fantastic.
Yeah, he's actually been one of the strongest advocates, not only for Ukraine, but for Georgia, because he was working under Bush, right when Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. And they did it on the way of, Bush was on his way out. He didn't want to draw America into a war. And then Obama came in and ignored the fact that, Russia just invaded a sovereign country, first time since World War II in Europe. And he argued at that time, that there should have been a stronger response, because allowing Russia to get away with Georgia resulted in then the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, and then the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and everything that's happening now.
Yep.
So,
all right.
Julie, someone's asking where to watch the Americans.
Yes. The first episode is dropping next week because we want to get a couple in the can in advance, since they're more cultural than they are, newsy. You could watch it here on the Mayday Network. So like and subscribe, and you will absolutely get an update as to when we post it. Michelle is hard at work doing an amazing promo, an amazing rollout of it. So that will hopefully go up today at some point. And if you're asking where to watch The Americans, the TV show, you could watch it on Hulu if you have Hulu for free. If not, I guess you could purchase it on Amazon or wherever, Apple TV. I have Hulu, so I watched it on Hulu. If you have not yet watched the first episode, watch it, the pilot. And then next week, we're going to be talking about episode 2. So watch that. And then we'll just do episode by episode. But the first one, we very much focused on what the political situation was like, both when the show was supposed to take place in the 1980s and also when the show premiered in the early 2000s, and also how that affects everything today. We got very political, but as we go on, we're going to be talking actually about the show itself and not so much about politics, because we all need a brain break for an hour.
A brain and a break.
Yeah, we need to just talk about some good
better than Russian spies.
Yeah, a good TV show with Russian spies that don't affect us. Of course, they still are here, so it's not like the Legals program is still not happening. I'm sure it is.
Oh yeah. Speaking of, there's if anyone's interested in actual Russian spies, there's one. I did a deep investigation on her over a year ago, but she is here in New York, in Brooklyn, and she just got sentenced for texting an FBI agent and trying to honeypot him. And I think she just was found guilty. I think she gets sentenced in a few months. So anyone who wants to
there you
look
go.
at a real life honeypot.
Yep. So it's that show is very good, but it's good because it's not unrealistic about how this all went down. Except I don't think people were going on murder sprees all over the United States, but maybe, who the hell knows? I don't know. Okay. So yes, watch The Americans and then come join us here, and we will let you guys know when we're rolling it out. It's going to be sometime early next week for the first episode, and then we'll just start rolling them out week by week. On that note, you guys, we could do Rosie, we could do The Godfather. We could do The Godfather. I love The Godfather. I just watched Godfather 2 the other day, and that movie's one of the best movies ever made. Okay. Great to see everybody. Yeah. All right. So good to see you all, and we'll see you all next week for another episode of Talks Americana. Bye.